The last anniversary night. That night should have been a happy milestone. 1 year in love. A simple anniversary evening. A young couple returning to their apartment after a few drinks and conversations about the future. No one could have imagined that just hours later, an emergency call would wake the entire neighborhood. And 5 days later, a girl who was only 21 years old would never return to her family. What shocked England in this case was not only the death of Chrissie Everard Hickson, but also the fact that the man standing before the court was the very person she trusted most. This is the story of a seemingly ordinary relationship, an anniversary night turned into tragedy, and an investigation that revealed the truth behind closed doors. Christine Everard Hickson, affectionately known as Chrissie by family and friends, was born and raised in Derbyshire, central England. To those who knew her, Chrissie was a gentle, affectionate girl, always ready to help others. She loved animals, enjoyed painting and music, and always made time for her family whenever possible. Friends remembered Chrissie as someone who always had a smile on her face. Although initially quite reserved, once you got to know her, she was very open and humorous. At 21, Chrissie was entering the best phase of her life. She had a stable job and plans for the future. She lived with her boyfriend in a small apartment in the village of Riddings, Derbyshire. Her boyfriend, Kane Tailby, was almost 9 years older than her. They had known each other for about a year before deciding to live together. According to information presented in court, there were no records of police intervention regarding domestic violence between the two. Neighbors only knew them as a young couple living quite discreetly. From the outside, their life seemed completely normal. Perhaps that's what made what happened afterward even more shocking to many. February 17, 2024, marked the 1-year anniversary of Chrissie and Kane meeting. To celebrate, they went to a local pub. According to those present that day, neither of them showed any unusual behavior. They chatted, had a few drinks, and left the bar late at night. No one thought that would be Chrissie's last public appearance. Around midnight, they returned to their apartment on Greenhill Lane. Behind closed doors, no one knows exactly what happened in the first few minutes. But according to the investigation, a quick argument ensued. The prosecution alleges the argument stemmed from Chrissie's suspicion that Kane was having an affair. It started with questions, but the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Suppressed emotions began to erupt. Neither could have imagined this would be their last conversation. Around 1 a.m., a downstairs neighbor suddenly heard loud noises coming from the apartment above. The sounds were loud enough to make him stop what he was doing to listen. Then, everything suddenly went silent. Just minutes later, the 999 emergency hotline received a call from that very apartment. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Chrissie unconscious with serious head injuries. Paramedics immediately took her to the hospital in critical condition. Meanwhile, Kane Tailby was detained for questioning. At the time, no one knew whether it was an accident, manslaughter, or murder. But what investigators found in the apartment, and the testimony gathered in the following days, completely changed the direction of the investigation. And just 5 days later, when Chrissie breathed her last in the hospital, the case officially became one of the most shocking cases in England in 2024. The prolonged argument and the emergency call. At dawn. When police began their investigation, the first question posed was simple. What happened inside the apartment in less than an hour? According to documents presented in court, after returning from the pub, Chrissie and Kane went into the kitchen. The cheerful atmosphere of the party quickly dissipated. The prosecution stated that the argument began when Chrissie suspected Kane of infidelity. What started as a simple exchange of questions escalated into a heated argument, with both losing their tempers. No security cameras recorded the events in the apartment, and there were no direct witnesses. Investigators gathered information from Kane's testimony, forensic evidence, and neighbors. According to the case file, at the height of the tension, Chrissie slapped Kane. This was a moment both sides referred to in court. However, the prosecution argued that Kane's subsequent reaction went far beyond self-defense. According to the defendant's later testimony, he pinned Chrissie to the kitchen floor. During the altercation, her head repeatedly hit the hard floor. No one witnessed those moments, but in the apartment below, a neighbor suddenly heard a loud noise coming from upstairs. He described it as a series of loud bangs, loud enough to make him stop what he was doing and pay attention. Then, everything suddenly went silent. The neighbor's testimony later became a crucial part of the investigation, as it matched the evidence found at the scene and what Kane admitted during questioning. After the altercation, Chrissie was unconscious. According to the medical examination results presented in court, she suffered a severe head injury and showed signs of bleeding from the ear, a symptom often associated with severe traumatic brain injury. Instead of calling emergency services immediately, Kane took Chrissie into the bathroom. According to the case file, he placed her in the bathtub and attempted to wipe the blood from her body. The motive for this action became a point of contention at the trial. The defense argued that Kane panicked and tried to help his girlfriend. Meanwhile, the prosecution questioned whether this delayed medical attention. It wasn't until around 1:20 a.m. that Kane called 999. A recording of the call shown in court showed him saying that the two had just argued and the situation had gotten out of control. However, according to prosecutors, this description did not fully reflect the severity of Chrissie's injuries. Just minutes later, the scene. Police and paramedics arrived at the apartment. The sight they witnessed was far from a typical collision. Chrissie lay motionless on the floor, unresponsive to those around her. Paramedics immediately performed CPR on the spot before transporting the victim to the hospital in critical condition. While doctors worked to save her life, police began sealing off the apartment to gather evidence. Every trace in the kitchen was noted. Every sample was collected. Every small detail could become a crucial link in reconstructing what happened that night. At the same time, Kane Tailby was brought to the police station for questioning. Initially, he described the incident as an unintentional scuffle, but as investigators continued to compare his testimony with the evidence gathered at the scene, the picture of the case began to change. They quickly realized that this might not have been just an accident following an argument, and the forensic examination results were: the announcements made in the coming days will form the basis for the entire prosecution process. The final 5 days, and the investigation that determined her fate. While paramedics transported Chrissie Everard Hickson to hospital, Derbyshire police investigators began their work at her apartment on Greenhill Lane. At the time, they didn't know if it was an accident, manslaughter, or murder. But just hours later, the first piece of evidence changed the direction of the investigation. At the hospital, doctors quickly performed a CT scan of Chrissie's head. The results showed she had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. Multiple fractures were visible on her skull, along with significant brain damage. Doctors immediately placed her in intensive care and used every means necessary to keep her alive. For Chrissie's family, the following days were almost hopeless. They took turns at her bedside, hoping for a miracle. But the miracle didn't happen. While doctors worked to save the victim's life, the criminal investigation team focused on the scene. The entire kitchen was sealed off. Forensic experts photographed every location, collected bloodstains, examined the floors, and documented every detail that could help reconstruct the events. According to documents presented in court, the results of the scene analysis were inconsistent with the hypothesis of a single fall. The evidence gathered suggests that multiple strong impacts may have occurred in the same area. This conclusion is crucial because if the injuries were caused by multiple impacts, the argument that Chrissie fell accidentally becomes less convincing. Alongside the crime scene investigation, investigators continued to question Kane Tailby. In his initial testimony, Kane claimed everything happened during an argument and that he had no intention of causing serious injury. However, when investigators compared his testimony with forensic evidence, new details began to emerge. According to the case file, Kane later admitted that in a fit of rage, he pinned Chrissie to the kitchen floor, causing her head to hit the floor repeatedly. This testimony was immediately compared to the neighbor's account. The man living downstairs said he heard several loud noises around that time. For the investigating team, this testimony, the testimony of an independent witness confirming the defendant's confession, significantly strengthened the chain of evidence. In the following days, police continued to gather data from phones, bar staff statements, and information related to the couple's schedule on the night of the incident. Those who had seen them earlier stated that Chrissie and Kane showed no unusual behavior when leaving the bar. This made the case even more perplexing. Just a short time after returning home, everything changed completely. 5 days after hospitalization, doctors had to deliver the heartbreaking conclusion: Chrissie's brain damage was too severe and irreversible. After consulting with the medical team, the family decided to discontinue life-sustaining measures. Chrissie Everard Hickson passed away at the age of 21. In their grief, her family made a humanitarian decision. They agreed to donate Chrissie's organs to help other patients awaiting organ transplants. That decision gave many people a chance at life and became one of the most talked about details after the trial. Following the victim's death, the case file was immediately changed. The initial charge against Kane Tailby was upgraded to murder. Prosecutors argued that the evidence gathered was sufficient to prove that this was not simply the result of an uncontrolled argument. Meanwhile, the defense maintained that Kane had no intention of taking Chrissie's life and requested that the case be considered manslaughter. Two completely contradictory arguments would soon be presented to the jury. And in the courtroom, all testimony, all forensic findings, and all evidence gathered throughout the investigation would be considered to answer the most important question: did Kane Tailby act in a fit of rage, or were his actions sufficient to constitute murder under English law? Trial and verdict. After only 2 hours of debate. After months of investigation, the case file was transferred to Nottingham Royal Court. This was the moment when all the evidence collected by the police would be presented to the jury. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was completely different from what the public had seen on the news. No more tape recordings. No more ambulances. Instead, there were dozens of files, forensic reports, witness statements, and questions for the jury to answer. Was Kane Tailby guilty of murder? Or was this simply a case of manslaughter that occurred when he lost control? From the beginning of the trial, the defense did not deny that Kane was responsible for the injuries that led to Chrissie's death. However, they argued that the incident was not premeditated and there was no intention to take the victim's life. According to the defense lawyers, the argument escalated. The elevator was moving too fast. Kane acted in a state of panic, and the consequences were beyond his control. Conversely, the Royal Prosecutor's Office presented a completely different argument. The prosecutors argued that the focus of the case wasn't on whether Kane had prepared beforehand. The crucial point was that the act occurred in the kitchen. According to them, repeatedly applying force to someone's head is an act that any adult should be aware of the potential for death. To prove this, the prosecution presented evidence to the jury. First was the autopsy report. Forensic doctors explained in detail the injuries to Chrissie's skull and brain. According to their professional assessment, these injuries were inconsistent with a typical fall and reflected multiple consecutive impacts. Next came the results of the crime scene investigation. Photographs taken in the kitchen along with bloodstains were analyzed in court. Forensic experts explained how they reconstructed the events based on the location of the traces and why they believed the incident involved more than one collision. Then, the downstairs neighbor was called to testify. He recounted hearing several loud noises coming from the apartment above early that morning. Notably, this testimony was entirely independent. He did not see the incident and did not know what was happening inside the apartment at that time. For the jury, this testimony was very valuable because it was consistent with the forensic evidence and Kane's subsequent testimony. However, the most impactful evidence came from the defendant himself. During the investigation, Kane admitted that he pinned Chrissie to the kitchen floor, causing her head to hit the floor multiple times. This testimony differed significantly from his description in the initial emergency call, where he only stated that the two had a physical altercation and the situation had gone out of control. The prosecution argued that the discrepancy between the two testimonies showed that Kane had not adequately described the extent of the violence from the outset. Conversely, the defense lawyers explained that their client was in a state of panic after the incident and therefore unable to accurately describe the events in the first call. After several days of trial, both sides completed their arguments. Now, the decision rests with the jury. Normally, a murder case can take hours or even days to deliberate, but in this case, the time was much shorter. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. Silence fell. All eyes were on the jury spokesperson. When asked about the verdict, the answer was just 2 short words: guilty. Kane Tailby was found guilty of murder. For Chrissie's family, it wasn't a victory. The verdict couldn't bring their daughter back. But it confirmed that what happened in the apartment on the morning of February 18, 2024, wasn't just an accident. A few days later, Kane Tailby returned to court to receive his sentence. The judge determined that the defendant's actions had taken the life of a young woman in the very home she believed to be her safest place. He sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment and also stipulated the minimum time Kane must serve before being considered for parole under English law. The trial concluded, but for Chrissie's family, the pain was only just beginning, and after the verdict was announced, they sent a message that resonated deeply across England. The verdict is over, but the pain remains. When Kane Tailby was led out of the courtroom to begin serving his life sentence, many believed the case was officially closed. Legally, that was true. The perpetrator had been convicted. The sentence had been pronounced. But for Chrissie Everard Hickson's family, the trial only marked the end of an investigation. It couldn't erase the void she left behind. Throughout the trial, Chrissie's parents and relatives were almost always present in court. They quietly listened to every testimony, every conclusion from the forensic experts. and every detail of their daughter's final hours. These were things no family wants to hear. After the trial ended, a family representative thanked the police, medical staff, and prosecutors for their work in bringing the case to light. They said that no sentence could compensate for the loss, but the fact that the truth had been established and those responsible for Chrissie's death had been held accountable brought the family some peace of mind. Another decision by the family also moved many. After doctors confirmed that Chrissie had no chance of recovery, the family agreed to donate her organs. In their most sorrowful moment, they still chose to give other patients waiting for organ transplants a chance at life. This was an act that was widely praised. It also reflected the person friends spoke of when talking about Chrissie, a girl who always cared about others. In the weeks following the trial, the case continued to be analyzed by the British media from many different angles, not only because of the sentence for Cain Tailby, but also because this story raises many questions about violence in romantic relationships. According to the case file, prior to the night of the tragedy, there was no information indicating that the police had intervened in the couple's relationship. Neighbors were also unaware of their frequent conflicts. This shows that not all signs of danger are easily recognizable from the outside. This is also why many experts believe that similar incidents need to be taken seriously, especially when arguments tend to escalate into violence. A moment of losing control can leave irreparable consequences for many families. Looking back at the entire case, what shocked many people most was the sudden change of fate. Just hours before, Chrissie and Cain had celebrated their one-year anniversary together. They left the pub like any other couple. No one could have imagined that it would be the last time Chrissie would step outside in good health. The next morning, she was admitted to intensive care. 5 days later, she died from her severe injuries. The whole thing happened in less than a week, but it changed the lives of many. For investigators, this case also underscored the importance of combining multiple sources of evidence: witness testimony, forensic findings, evidence at the scene, data collected during the investigation, and even the defendant's own testimony. Only by piecing all these pieces together can the complete picture be revealed, and the jury have sufficient grounds to reach a verdict. Today, Chrissie Everard Hickson's name is still mentioned in many real-life crime programs in England as a reminder of the serious consequences of violence in relationships. Behind every criminal case is more than just the law or the sentence. It was also a person with unfulfilled dreams, a family learning to live with loss, and loved ones who will forever remember a life that ended too soon. Thank you for following this entire case file. If you are interested in real-life cases, evidence-based investigations, and objective analyses of the crime-solving process, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. See you again in another real-life crime case file.